Hello, everyone. A few announcements today. First of all, please pardon the workaround. Our projector doesn't work, so this is our backup projector. I have a few events that I just want to remind you of. On Friday this week, for Friday afternoon at the movies at 2 o'clock, we are presenting The Ballad of Wallace Island. Next week on Wednesday, we have Eric Andrew Gee presenting his new book, The Mind Mappers, Friendship, Betrayal, and the Obsessive Quest to Chart the Brain. That's at 2 o'clock here in the auditorium. For those of you who are impacted by tomorrow's power outage, the library is a warming station, so there will be free coffee and tea in the lobby. And as of 10 o'clock, you are more than welcome to come and warm up here. So that's it for me. Without further ado, here's Dr. Joe Schwartz with Science Demystified.
Gee, free coffee. That's enticing. Yeah. Okay, let's get going. I come across something very interesting. This is a German weather house, as it is called, and dates back to the early 1700s. And it's a weather predictor. If the weather is going to be hot and sunny, the woman comes out. If it is going to be rainy, the man who's actually holding an umbrella swings out. So they're like on a little turntable. Okay. Now the reason that I find this interesting is because of the mechanism by which it works. I had never heard of this until I just came across it last week. The little turntable is suspended in the middle, like this. But you know what? A thread of human hair. Why? Anyone guess? Yes. Hair expands and contracts depending on humidity, right? When there's a lot of moisture in the air, when it's very humid, the hair picks up the water and it expands. And when it's dry, it contracts. And it's a significant difference. The difference is about 3%. Anyone who has curly hair knows this, because in a humid situation it becomes much more curly because each of the curls expands. So I thought that, it's really quite fascinating that they thought of this in the early 1700s. Horsehair also works. And so it's just the hair, I think it's more than one hair. They're twisted together and it's under tension, twisted. And when it untwists and twists, because of the change in length, it causes the little pedestal to swing around. Really quite fascinating. I wanted one. They're actually very hard to find. Well, no, I shouldn't say they're hard to find. If you go on Amazon, you can find dozens and dozens of them, but they're all modern. They're just made now. I don't know what the mechanism is of the modern ones. Maybe it's cat gut. You know what cat gut is? Nothing to do with cats. It is the dried intestine of sheep, and that has the same property. It can expand and contract. So I think that's what it's used. But obviously there could be some modern mechanism that works also. Nobody here by any chance has one of these. The real ones, the ones that date back to the 1700s. There's one that I found. A German collector is selling it, and he wants about 4,000 for it. But you can buy on Amazon the current ones, and they look very nice. They're the size of a cuckoo clock roughly, and nice. And you can get them for $30, $40, $50, something like that. It's sort of a interesting little thing. It's accurate. I mean, yeah, it's accurate. I mean, it measures humidity very well. And the interesting thing is that about 50 years after this was made, this folkloric thing, an inventor actually made the first hygrometer, the first real device to measure humidity in the air based upon that principle. You would have thought that it would have been the other way around, that some scientist would have come up with this idea and then someone made a toy thing out of it. But this is actually the other way around, which is interesting. Anyway, I'd like to see it work. Anyway, now you know why hair goes more frizzy in humid conditions. Anyway, I mean, obviously the reason that this got my attention is because it is an example of chemistry, right? Hair is keratin, which is a protein, and it picks up moisture from the air. Water molecules bind to it by what we call hydrogen bonding. Anyway, that's the secret behind the whole thing. So I was like when you find something that is sort of an interesting chemical application, because most people are scared of chemistry, right? And then there are those who think that it's boring, or they connect it with a mad scientist. Often the mad scientist is an evil scientist, wants to take over the world, or they think that chemists are these odd creatures who are locked up in their laboratories thinking about what new cancer-causing additive to unleash on the unsuspecting public. And then there are those who think that chemists are a totally different breed altogether. And they think that the word chemical is synonymous with toxin or poison. And you go into a bookstore and this is what you find: dangerous ingredients and toxic stuff. And this chemophobia has gone so far that you can actually have a petition circulating trying to ban dihydrogen monoxide because it causes death by inhalation, corrodes metals, causes electrical short circuits. It is found in cancerous tumors. All of that, of course, is true. But obviously, what we're talking about is good old H2O or water. But scientific illiteracy is so widespread that you can actually get people to sign a petition to ban dihydrogen monoxide, because anything that has sort of a chemical name is deemed to be dangerous. But one of the most outlandish things I've come across is this chemistry set, which you can buy now. And look what it says. No chemicals required. So here is a chemistry set with no chemicals required. And indeed, there is nothing in it. And they, tell you to buy sodium bicarbonate and vinegar and do some experiments with that. But how ridiculous it is to sell a chemistry set with no chemicals. Actually, I remember my first chemistry set, which I got. It must have been around 1960. Had a lot of toxic stuff in it. I remember it had cobalt compounds. Cobalt compounds are pretty toxic, but they also change color with the temperature and with moisture. So there were experiments with that. There was some mercury in there. But this now, the pendulum has absurdly swung, in the other extreme direction. No chemistry set with no chemicals. And that's because, so many people think that chemistry is the work of the devil, whereas I think it should be in the limelight, because chemistry really is the thread that ties all the other sciences together. The definition of chemistry is the study of matter and the changes that matter undergoes. Everything in the world is made of matter. So all the changes, of course, are chemical changes. And the fact is that chemicals should not be feared and, of course, should not be worshipped. They should just be understood. And there's a reason that they should be understood, is because, of course, everything is made of chemicals. So if you wonder about how your cleaning agents work and whether or not there's any potential toxicity, if you want to know which are the best ones to remove the rust from bathtub, I mean, those are all chemical questions. When it comes to medications, same thing. I mean, everything that happens in the body is a consequence of chemical reactions, and everything that you do to intervene in terms of pharmaceuticals, you're intervening in those chemical reactions. But it's not only man-made things that we need to understand in terms of chemistry, nature. I mean, when you take a look at what happens with the changing leaves, there's fascinating chemistry that goes on there. And of course, when you are concerned about what you put into your mouth, how do we know? Because we know the chemistry of the food, right? I mean, we know what the composition is. We know how it can interact with the body. We know that when we grow the food and we use fertilizers, well, why does that work? Obviously, that is also based on chemical reactions. And then when you worry about what happens when you put the food into your body, whether or not the cholesterol in the egg is going to affect your blood cholesterol, that's a chemical question. And if you want to keep that food fresh and you wrap it in plastic, well, plastics, of course, are the end product of various chemical reactions. And of course, this is not to say that there are not issues that arise. Of course there are. I mean, you know, we've talked before about the use of plastics and the worries these days about microplastics and nanoplastics and the tremendous amount of plastic waste that we generate. I mean, you have one meal in a restaurant and, that's the remnants of it. And we have to look for solutions, what to do about that. But that's also in the domain of chemistry. We can recycle these plastics. And that bench, for example, is made from recycled food containers. That sweater is made from recycled water bottles, polyester bottles. Well, it can be done. I mean, you can't recycle everything, right? We can't and don't want to recycle toilet paper. But many things can be recycled. So anyway, the point of this little introduction here is that we spend our life deciding which path we're going to take. And that is a question of chemistry, of deciding how we're going to use chemicals, what are dangers, what are not. And I actually illustrated that with a very interesting throwback to history. The molecules that you're looking at there are mirror images of each other, just like your hands, right? Your hands are mirror images. They're non-superimposable. You cannot put one hand on top of the other and match, right? That's the definition of a mirror image. Molecules can also exist in mirror images. That's what you're looking at there. And these mirror image forms can behave very differently. The classic example of this is thalidomide. Now, thalidomide is historically a notorious drug. It was given to women in the 1960s who were pregnant and who had morning sickness. It was a drug used to treat the nausea associated with morning sickness. And, the consequences of that were terrible. Children were born with missing limbs or malformed limbs. There were about 10,000 of those children, most of them in Europe, mostly in Germany. Thalidomide was never approved in Canada. It was never approved in the US, although there were some victims because some doctors did give it out as experimentally provided by pharmaceutical companies, but it was never approved. And it really is a tragic history because thalidomide was tested at that time as well as any drug was supposed to be tested. It was tested in rats, it was tested in mice, it was even tested in monkeys. The only problem was that all the testing was done during the first trimester of pregnancy because there was a lot of evidence by that time, and which is still true, that if there's going to be any tragic intervention with the embryo, it's in the first 3 months. That's the most dangerous time. It passed with flying colors. There were no problems. Thalidomide was unique in the sense that it caused problems only in late pregnancy. And it was never tested in monkeys for that because there was no evidence at the time that it should be tested. But what is really interesting here is that the two enantiomers, as we call them, the two mirror image isomers of this compound behaved very differently. One of them turned out to be teratogenic. That is, that's the one that caused the malformed babies. The other one, the other mirror image compound, is actually a useful sedative. So that, of course, was the one that was desired, right? But unfortunately, it turned out that in the body, these two interconvert. So although the original testing in animals had shown that they should never use the teratogenic one because in animals they had seen that, but the other one was totally safe, but they didn't understand that in the body the two would interconvert. So it's a tragic story, but it was a very unusual occurrence. And it wasn't because of any kind of stupidity by researchers or any kind of negligence. It was just a totally unpredictable kind of effect. And the interesting thing about it is that thalidomide is still with us. It, of course, is obviously not ever prescribed to pregnant women, but it turns out to be very effective in the treatment of multiple myeloma, which is a type of cancer. So this introduces, what I think is the most important concept, and one that I stress all the time when you're talking about life, is that there are no safe substances, only safe ways to use substances. And it isn't always easy to determine that because unexpected things happen. And they may happen not due to anyone's negligence. Just not everything is predictable. I think we go back to an old alchemical expression that if you play with fire, you may get burned. And the fact is that every time that we do chemical manipulations, yeah, in a sense, you're playing with fire because when you're trying something new, you never know what the outcome is going to be. Of course, today we have much more knowledge, so we're much better at predicting, what may or may not happen. But I give you, a couple of classic examples here of how a substance can be useful or beneficial, and also how you never know how you're going to come upon that information. So let's go back for a moment to the 19th century and a Swiss chemist by the name of Christian Friedrich Schumbein. who, at least as the story goes, would sometimes do his experiments at home in his kitchen. And one day he was working with some nitric acid and sulfuric acid, which he happened to spill on the floor. Luckily for him, Frau Schembine was not home at the time, so he knew that he better wipe up this mess before she reappeared. So he grabbed the first thing that he could, which happened to be his wife's cotton apron that was hanging on the wall in the kitchen. And he took this apron and he mopped up the mess on the floor. And then he had a wet apron on his hands. And he knew she wouldn't want to see a wet apron when she came home, so he better dry it. So he hung it up in front of the fireplace to dry. And the next thing he realized was that it burst into flame, disappeared without any soot, without any smoke whatsoever. Well, that was interesting observation. Most people would have said, gee, where do I quickly go and buy another apron? But he thought about it, and he realized that what he had just witnessed was a chemical reaction. He knew that the apron was made of cotton, and that the chemical that made up most of cotton was cellulose. And he figured that his acids would have reacted with the cellulose and changed it in such a way as to make it flammable, which is exactly what happened. But what he also noticed was that when the apron burned, it produced no smoke. And that was critical, because in those days, they had old-fashioned gunpowder, which was made of sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter. And when a weapon was fired on the battlefield, there would be a tremendous amount of smoke that would obscure the target. And furthermore, it would tell the enemy exactly where the weapon had been fired from, because there would be a cloud of smoke hanging there. Well, Schembine realized that he had accidentally come upon a material that burned without producing any smoke, and that it could be ground up into a powder, and thus was born smokeless gunpowder, which is the gunpowder that is still used today. And that came out of this accidental discovery. But then, of course, say, well, gunpowder isn't that bad. Well, depends on how you use it, isn't it? If you use it to blow up buildings, yes. But when you use it to mine important minerals, no. So it is not inherently good or bad. It all depends on how it is used. And there are so many examples in our everyday life about this. There's one that just came out this week about a lawsuit in the US, class action lawsuit against Costco, because the chicken, which is one of their most popular items, I suspect some of you buy the Costco chicken. Yes? Who buys Costco chicken? Yeah. Why do you buy it? Because it's relatively cheap and it's good, right? And of course, it's at the back of the store, so you have to walk through the whole store and buy all of the stuff that you don't need to get it the chicken. In the US, they've kept the price at $4.99 for years and years. I don't know what it is here. It's how much? $7.99? Really? That's a damn good deal, right? Yeah. I'm sure for them that's a loss leader, but it's worth it. Anyway, what was this about with this lawsuit? Two women, California, where else, claim that they were misled because the ad says that it has no preservatives. And they didn't want to buy any food that had preservatives in it. They were misled, and they say that millions of Americans were misled and spent millions and millions of dollars on this chicken they would have not spent otherwise because it contains preservative. Well, that's of course total BS. People would buy that $4.99 chicken if it contained arsenic, because what they look for is the price. Anyway, this is just an absurd attempt at money grab, these large lawsuits in the US. But anyway, what are they talking about? Well, if you look at what is in that chicken, the first ingredient is chicken. All right. But there's also some sodium phosphate and carrageenan. This is what the lawsuit is all about. Well, the truth is that these are not preservatives. Sodium phosphate is in the chicken because it helps retain moisture, which is what you want. You don't want that chicken to dry out. Carrageenan is also added to the chicken for the same reason. So the phosphate and the carrageenan together keep the chicken moist. This is not a preservative action. This is a functional action that changes the texture and possibly, the taste of the chicken because it becomes more moist. So the whole idea that these are preservatives, as mentioned in the lawsuit, that is just false. Well, these women argue that the term preservative doesn't only refer, as of course in science we think, to the growth of bacteria, viruses, fungi. That's what you try to prevent with preservatives. They say that these things interfere with the way that chicken would taste naturally. That is, that if you added nothing to it and you just barbecued it, never mind the fact that just the barbecue process is far more dangerous than, any kind of added. So this is just absurd. The sodium phosphate and the carrageenan are not a problem whatsoever. They are safely used here. Yes, you can say that if you took a spoonful of sodium phosphate and ate it, that would not be a good idea, although I don't think anything terrible would happen there either. But the minimal amount that is put into that chicken is nothing. And furthermore, phosphate occurs naturally in our body. The molecule in our body from which we get energy is ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And the way we get the energy is that breaks down into ATP, adenosine diphosphate. What happens to the phosphate that was lost? That's in our system. No different from the phosphate in the food. So anyway, this is completely ridiculous, but in the US, you get away with these class action lawsuits, and many of them are dismissed. But usually what happens is that they have an out-of-court settlement. And these women are hoping for that Costco will come through and pay them off to make this thing go away, which might very well happen. So anyway, the fact that chemicals can be a double-edged sword, of course, is clear. I mean, a classic example, obviously, would be morphine, right? I mean, everyone agrees that morphine, when needed, is a wonderful drug. When you have intractable pain, go for the morphine. But of course, if you're injecting it into your veins because you want to get high and you overdose on it, that's a different story. But that molecule of morphine did not make the decision whether or not to be used as a painkiller or to jump into someone's vein. I mean, the decision is made by humans. And no matter what drug you look at, you can look at it in that way. It has a good side and a downside. So it's sort of a Jekyll and Hyde effect, right? And you have to understand both sides. So I'm going to look at one other drug like that because it takes us into a very interesting story, and that is quinine. Now, most of you will have heard of quinine as the classic treatment for malaria, or if you haven't heard of that, you know that tonic water contains trace amounts of quinine. That's irrelevant because the amount that is in there is trivial. It just gives it a little bit of a bitter taste. But quinine occurs in nature. It is found in the bark of the cinchona tree, which grows in Peru. And this goes back to when the first conquistadors from Spain came to America. They learned about this from the natives who had, over the years, accidentally discovered that the bark of this tree would cure fevers. How do you accidentally discover those things? Because before the advent of modern science, people were sick. What were their options? You would try to change whatever you consume, because that's the only way that you could alter, what happens in the body. So they would try herbs, plants of all kinds. And someone tried an extract of the bark of the cinchona tree and found that it worked. Anyway, today we no longer use quinine to treat malaria, not because it doesn't work, it works very well, but because it has been supplanted by drugs that work even better. However, believe it or not, you can still buy quinine. You can buy it in some health food stores. You can buy it online, not for malaria, but for restless leg syndrome. And as you can see here, this cinchona bark for relief of the nighttime cramp is what they sell this for. Well, the fact is that it doesn't really work for that, except in extremely high doses. And what we know is that there are real risks associated with that. No physician will recommend using quinine for nighttime cramps, but it's all over social media. It's all over the internet. And people who have those leg cramps will try anything. So they will try those supplements of cinchona bark. And I mean, some doctors will even prescribe it because people push them. And you know that if something is allowed to be sold, which it is because it is still an available treatment for malaria, once it's allowed, once it has been approved by Health Canada, they can prescribe it off-label for anything. So if some patient, persists in asking for quinine because of their leg cramps, there are some doctors who do prescribe it, which is unfortunate because of all the side effects that we know. But the reason that I bring up the whole quinine story is because it is such an interesting substance. And it takes us to the story of colors and dyes, which I really like to talk about because those are such interesting examples of chemistry. If we go back historically, remember the story of Joseph and his multicolor coat, right? Either the biblical story, or if you've seen the musical version, Andrew Lloyd Webber's. This was one of Andrew Lloyd Webber's first shows, Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Great music. Who was the original Joseph in the musical? Come on. Donny Osmond. Yeah. Anyway, a great musical. Now, how in biblical times would they have had these colors? This was long before synthetic chemistry. So where did they come from? They came from nature, of course. If you wanted red, you better know where the madder plant grew, because from the root of that plant, you could extract a red dye. If you wanted blue, you would look for indigo, right? And where would you go to look for indigo? Look at the word India. Indigo came from India. So those were natural dyes, right? However, today we have a whole spectrum of dyes, every color that you could ever wish for. And of course, these can be used to color fabrics. And we have beautiful colors of all kinds. But today, these are mostly synthetic dyes. And this is where the story gets interesting because of the prototype of these dyes, which was mauve. Mauve was sort of a shade of purple, but no one had ever seen this color before 1856. There was a related color known as Tyrian purple, which was extracted from some shellfish, mostly in Lebanon, which is also the dye that was used in the talit. You know, it's very specific to the color that you have to use. So there were natural purples around, but this was a totally new color. Now we go back to the area of Queen Victoria, which is, of course, was 1800s. And Victoria was married to Prince Albert. Albert was of German origin, but had married Victoria, so obviously they were living in England. And he was very much aware of the importance of science. And he also knew from his background in Germany that at that time, most of the really high quality of science was, especially in chemistry, was being done in Germany. And that was correct. I mean, some of the German chemists like Liebig and Bunsen of, you know, Bunsen burner fame, they really were spectacular in chemistry. So Albert wanted to increase chemical knowledge in England. And he invited Adolf Wilhelm Hofmann, one of the top German chemists, who indeed had trained under Liebig. Liebig was probably the top chemist of the 1800s. And Albert invited him to come to England to set up the first formal Institute of Chemistry where chemistry would be taught. It would be called the Royal College of Chemistry. Now, of course, this is not to say that there was no chemistry taught in England at that time. Of course, there was. There had been many brilliant English chemists, Humphrey Davy, Michael Faraday, John Dalton. These were all pioneers in chemistry. But Albert wanted more broad education, and he thought that this would be the way to start it. So Hofmann agreed, and he came to England, and they set up the Royal College of Chemistry. But it was mostly for mature students who today we would say would be in university. But one day he was approached. There was a knock on the door. A young 16-year-old, William Henry Perkin, who told Hofmann that he had become very interested in chemistry. He had been reading books about chemistry, and he would just love to be part of this Royal College. But he was too young, Hofmann said. But it seems that Perkin was very persistent, and he said he would do anything. He would wash glassware, he would help the other students, etc. And Hofmann finally agreed. And it turned out that young Perkin was very smart, and he was able to catch the concepts very quickly. He was very good at helping the other students carry out chemical reactions. And then the Easter holidays rolled around when the Institute was going to be shut down for 2 weeks of holiday. And young Perkin did not want to be without chemistry for 2 weeks. You can understand that. Who would? So he went to Hofmann and he said, you know, is there anything that I can do? Any experiment that, you know, I can do at home? And Hofmann said, no, go home and relax, take a break. And he said, no, you know, I really want to pursue my studies there, anything else. And then Hofmann said, look, you know, there's this substance quinine, which normally is extracted from the bark of this tree in Peru. and it is used to treat malaria, but the trouble is that we don't have enough of it. Malaria at that time was a rampant disease. And said, we don't have enough, so we would like somehow to be able to replicate what that tree does, what the cinchona tree does. Now, at this time, they were already able to do chemical analysis to a certain degree. They were able to determine the elemental composition of a substance. They knew nothing about molecular structure, but they could determine what elements were present in a substance. So Hoffman himself had done some work on quinine, and he discovered that its composition was what you see here. Those were the elements that were present in cinchona bark, but they knew nothing about how these were joined together. They knew nothing about molecular structure. But Hoffman had also done some work on coal and the tar that was left behind when coal burned. Coal tar, as it was called. And that contained a compound called aniline, which was very similar in its elemental composition to quinine that I showed you, except for one thing. It didn't have any oxygen. So it occurred to Hoffman, as he then suggested to young Perkin, to somehow try to incorporate oxygen into this aniline. And he said, look, why don't you try some chemicals, which we call oxidizing agents, that add oxygen to a molecule, take your aniline, let's see if you can make quinine out of it. Now, of course, in retrospect, this was absolutely impossible. Quinine is a very complex molecular structure, but hindsight is always easy, you know, when you look back. At that time, it made sense. So Perkin went home, and in his house, he built a little laboratory, and he carried out this experiment. He took aniline and he added the oxidizing agent, but he just got various gucks and gummy materials that usually were very difficult to clean. And he had trouble cleaning his glassware. But one day, after one of these failed experiments, couldn't clean the glassware the normal way with water, he decided to try a different solvent. He tried alcohol. He poured alcohol into the dirty flask, and all of a sudden, the flask turned into this brilliant new color. That's the color that came to be called mauve. Well, he immediately recognized that he had made an important discovery. For the first time, he had made a dye in the laboratory. Now, luckily for him, his father had money. So he borrowed money because he recognized the potential commercial importance of this. He borrowed money from his father, and he built a factory. And that factory that you see here, it was near, just on the outskirts of London. And he started to manufacture his mauve from aniline. It became very popular, especially when Queen Victoria started to wear dresses colored mauve. I mean, if it was good enough for the Queen, everyone wanted that. And the color became so popular that the decade after discovery, the stamps that were minted in England at that time were minted with mauve. And the decade is still referred to as the mauve decade. And all because of that interesting and accidental discovery. But you know, as Louis Pasteur said, chance favors the prepared mind. Someone else may have seen this and said, how the hell do I clean that sink now? Right? But he recognized the importance of the discovery. This launched the dye industry because obviously if you could make one color, there was a chance of making other colors also from starting materials in coal tar, and it turned out to be the case. And by the end of the 1800s, they were synthesizing all kinds of colors. And Perkin became immensely wealthy from this. He retired in his 30s, but he still continued to do independent research. In fact, he came up with a reaction we call the Perkin reaction, which we still teach to students in organic chemistry. And he became the elder statesman of chemistry. This is his famous portrait, which hangs in the Portrait Gallery in London, where he is holding a silk streamer that was colored with his original dye. In the United States, in recognition of the contribution of Perkin to the dye industry, and incidentally, it was also an important contribution to the pharmaceutical industry, because if you could make dyes, maybe you could make pharmaceuticals as well. And many of the pharmaceutical companies, like Bayer and IG Farben, the big German companies, started out as dye companies and then switched to making pharmaceuticals. So anyway, in the US, the contributions of Perkin were recognized by the Perkin Medal, which is given out every year to an industrial chemist who has made a significant contribution. And the first recipient of the Perkin Medal in 1906 was Perkin himself, because he was invited to come on a lecture tour to America, and he would be honored by the first ever Perkin Medal at a restaurant in New York, and that's the restaurant Delmonico, where the annual Perkin Award is still given out. There have been a few years when it was in other cities, but mostly it is there. So in chemistry, it's a huge historic landmark, that restaurant, but that's the closest I'll ever come to a Perkin dinner invitation. Anyway, so in 1906, he was invited to be honored as the first recipient, and this is that dinner, and there's Perkin and the bearded one in the middle. He received the award. Well, ever since that time, every year it is awarded, and people who get invited get an envelope, an invitation, which is sort of thick. And the reason it's thick is because it comes with a bow tie, which is dyed mauve. And it is actually dyed with his original mauve, because when he came in 1906, he brought with him a little bottle that he had made back in 1856. So in 1906, he brought this, and he gifted it to Columbia University. And every year they take out a smidgen of that, because that's all you need, to dye some silk, out of which they make the bow tie. And then these days they make a scarf for women, because women are now also allowed. So it's interesting. And the bottle is not very big, but I have a colleague at Columbia, and one day we sneaked in to where this is kept in a showcase, and he had a key to it. So I have a tiny bit of sample of that, of his original mauve. Anyway, so I mean, it's a fascinating chemical story in many ways, because of the accidental discovery, the recognition of the accidental discovery, and of course also because of the industry that it launched. But it had so many tentacles. For example, once they understood the chemistry of these dyes, Paul Ehrlich in Germany was baffled by the fact that when you looked under a microscope, and by this time microscopes are well in use, and you were looking at bacteria, sometimes you could not see them properly. They were not well defined. And he started to experiment by adding some dyes to the slide to see if bacteria would absorb some dye and therefore make them more visible. And indeed, that turned out to be the case. And he found a dye that was particularly effective in being absorbed by the bacteria that cause syphilis. So he thought to himself, gee, if these bacteria absorb that dye, would it be possible to make that dye toxic to kill the bacteria? Right? A very logical thing. Well, how do you make something toxic? He knew, of course, that arsenic was essentially a poison. So he synthesized a dye that had an arsenic atom in it. And this turned out to be a pharmaceutical called salvarsan. And it was the first treatment. It was really the first antibiotic, which effectively treated syphilis. It would not have happened had Perkin not made that discovery. This was essentially a direct outgrowth of that. So by the early 1900s, chemists had become pretty good at manipulating molecules. And then a huge breakthrough came in the 1930s when they learned how to put small molecules together into long chains that we call polymers. And the classic polymer that was first synthesized in the 1930s was nylon. The name is interesting. Originally, DuPont, the manufacturer, wanted to call it Duperoo, for DuPont pulls a rabbit out of a hat, the acronym. But eventually they didn't go for that and came up with nylon, which is not an abbreviation for anything. It just sounded like a good term. And it, of course, had tremendous applications. The one that you immediately think of, indeed, was the first application, and that was the nylon stocking. And on so-called Nylon Day, when it was first sold to the public, ladies stood in line around the block, this is at Macy's in New York, to get their hands on these new stockings made from petroleum, because that's where the raw materials came from. And some of them couldn't even wait to get home. They would sit down on the curb there and try on the stockings. And then the war came, and nylon found another use, and that was in parachutes. Parachutes are very finicky things because you need a fabric that can be folded into a very small compartment and which easily opens up, right? And nylon fit the bill perfectly. But by this time, the sales of stockings was skyrocketing. So they need to get some of them back. And as you see, Uncle Sam needs your nylon stockings. And there was a huge effort to try to get back the nylon stockings and recycle them into parachutes. Well, some of during the war, of course, the Americans were also active in the Pacific, and temperatures there were very hot. And one problem with that, of course, is the food supply. How do you supply food to the soldiers? And the refrigeration was not possible. You needed foods that provided lots of energy, but which did not need refrigeration. And chocolates were an example, but chocolates melt under warm conditions. So the U.S. Army approached the Hershey's company to come up with a chocolate that would not melt. And they did. And this was the famous Hershey's tropical chocolate bar. And there was a lot of experimentation that went into this because you had to do a lot of manipulating. They took out some of the cocoa butter because that's what makes the chocolate melt more easily. And they put in some oat flour. Nothing wrong with that nutritionally, of course, but it doesn't taste exactly like chocolate. Some of the soldiers complained of the graininess, etc., but at least it did not melt. But there was another possible solution to the not melting, and that was discovered by the Mars and Murray company, and those were the original M&Ms sold like this in these tubes. And they were sold only to the military originally, because the candy coating prevented the chocolate inside from melting. After the war, it became very popular. It was introduced to the public, and everyone wanted these candies that were candy coated. Until 1976, when there was a lot of publicity about a study done by the Soviets that showed that red dye number 2 is carcinogenic. Well, at first the Americans said, what do the Soviets know about red? And they said, no, this is meaningless. But word had gotten out about this Soviet study, and people were worried. So the FDA in the US actually recalled all candies that were colored with red dye number 2. They never used that in M&Ms. They used a different one, red dye number 40. There was never any red dye number 2. Later, it turned out anyway, red dye number 2 was not a problem anyway. But in 1976, the FDA recalled the red dye number 2, and Mars and Murray decided, even though they had never used that dye, they were worried that people would think that they were using that dye, so they removed all of the red M&Ms. This caused a panic in the population because people loved the red M&Ms, right? For no particular reason. And rumors started that the reason that the red M&Ms disappeared was because workers were stealing them from the assembly line because the red dye is an aphrodisiac, which of course is not true. As you all know, it's the green ones that are. Anyway, so red dye number 2 was never used in M&Ms. What they had always used was red dye number 40. Anyway, so there was big guffaw over this, but it eventually, like most scares, it died away. And by 1987, the red dye M&Ms returned. And they returned not only in the usual M&Ms, but you could actually buy all red M&Ms, which became a huge thing, especially on Halloween, because it was still associated with an aphrodisiac effect. Another interesting thing about M&Ms is that it is the one candy that actually went out of this world. Astronauts took M&Ms, and it's interesting when you can see videos of this when they try to eat it in space because the M&Ms are floating around and they're hard to catch. Today, of course, we have all kinds of M&Ms. You have peanut M&Ms, you have almond M&Ms, etc. And you have all of the different colors. There's still some issue about the colors because, as you know, there's some opposition to the so-called synthetic dyes. People want all natural dyes. But M&Ms use the synthetic dyes because they're much brighter than the ones that the so-called natural dyes. And people, especially children, like the bright colors. Well, anyway, at this time of the year, it is sort of opportune anyway to talk about chocolates because Valentine's Day is coming up. And chocolates obviously are intimately associated with Valentine's. Because they also supposedly have an aphrodisiac effect. Where is this tradition from that a gentleman shows up on a lady's doorstep bearing chocolates, hoping for consequences? Well, what's the chemistry here? There actually is something interesting. And it's a chemical that is found in chocolates called phenylethylamine. And the reason that this is interesting, because phenylethylamine is also found in the human body. It is in fact found in the brain. And it is responsible for mood, for feelings of well-being. So you can kind of see this association. It's found in the body, it does good things, and it's found in the chocolate. right? Well, it turns out that it does not get absorbed when you eat phenylethylamine. It does not get absorbed into the brain. It does not cross the blood-brain barrier. It actually goes out in the urine. So the fact is that people who eat chocolate have different urine than others because of phenylethylamine, but it does not go into the brain. Chocolates go directly to the hips. They do not pass go in the brain. So it's a story that, of course, will be trotted out again. You can be guaranteed of that in a couple of weeks. They will talk about chocolate being an aphrodisiac, and they'll bring in the phenylethylamine, but there really is no real substance to this. So anyway, I think you see that there are a lot of interesting things in the world when we start looking at them through the chemical lens. And hopefully we're curious about these things, but you also know the expression about the other side of curiosity, right? That curiosity killed the cat. Well, the only way that curiosity will kill that cat is if someone has tried to clean that toilet with a mixture of an acidic substance and bleach. Because when you mix those two, you get the liberation of chlorine. Chlorine is highly toxic. And there are people who have ended up in hospital because of this. They try to clean their toilet with Saniflush, doesn't clean well. They'll then try bleach, get the reaction, they inhale the chlorine, and it eats away at their lungs. But of course, if you understand the chemistry, you won't make that mistake. So the fact is that chemicals really do conform to this Mr. Hyde and Dr. Jekyll story, which is another interesting chemical story that I'll tell you at another time. The real answer to this is knowledge. You have to know how to use chemicals. So we have to be careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? There are those who say that all chemicals should be locked away, not used. This is absolute nonsense. What we need is to understand and to use them properly. So anyway, I hope that maybe I've satisfied some of your curiosity here, and that next time you see this image of the mad scientist, you'll fight it and understand that chemistry is there in every aspect of your life, whether it's the food that you eat, the cosmetics you use, the drugs that you take. And what we need to do is understand it, not panic because you see some story that in some monstrous dose in a rat, something causes a problem. You have to look beyond the headlines. And sometimes it isn't easy because, of course, we live in an extremely complex world where we have this complex machine called the human body interacting with thousands and thousands of substances out there, and you can't always predict what will happen. So that's it. That's our story for today. If anyone has any questions or comments or wants to donate their weather house to me. Yes. I mean, nutritionally speaking, dark chocolate is better. Dark chocolate contains a much higher concentration of antioxidants than white chocolate. Now, whether or not that can make any difference in the grand scheme of things, I doubt it. But I would say that if you are going to have some chocolate for dessert after your dinner, it does make sense to have dark chocolate instead of milk chocolate. Doesn't taste as good, right? Yeah, I mean, the 70% is not bad. If you go above 70% cocoa, I mean, they sell some 90% cocoa. I mean, it's inedible. Yes, I mean, the story has been that cadmium and lead are found in dark chocolate more. I've looked at those studies. That is, it is true, except that the amounts are so small that I mean, if the chocolate is going to worry you about lead or cadmium, you're eating way too much chocolate. Yeah. Recycling. Hmm. What about it? In recycling? Well, I mean, one of the common ways of recycling plastics is to break them down into their original components and make new plastics out of them. Yeah, I mean, this is, I told you that that sweater is made of recycled water bottles. Okay, the water bottles are made of polyester, which is a polymer. Chemically, you break them down into the individual units from which it was made, and you make fresh polymer. One, there's only one dye. Yeah, cochineal, carmine. Yes, it's on the label is either cochineal or as carmine. Yes, and of course that brings up the kosher question. There's no question there because the judgment by all kinds of rabbis is that if the final product is such that it is not identifiable in terms of what it came from, because it could also be made synthetically, then there's no issue. And that's the thing with carmine. Okay, you can in the lab make carmine, or you can extract it from the insect, but you can't tell from the final product where it came from. Oh, carmine is mostly made from the insect because it's much cheaper. Oh yeah, cost. Only red. Only red. Yeah. About? Yeah. Yeah. What organic chocolate means is that they can charge you more money, money for it. It means that whatever is added to it has to come from a natural source, right? So, for example, in milk chocolate, the organic will not use milk powder because it has undergone chemical manipulation. The cocoa trees that are used to, from which the cocoa beans are harvested for organic, cannot be treated with fungicides or pesticides of any kind. But in terms of organic with chocolate, it will make no difference because nobody eats enough chocolate where that would make a difference. That is some money grab. Yeah. That's a different story. That has nothing to do with this particular lawsuit. The chickens are in this plastic container, and the question was whether or not microplastics will form. That is probably true. I mean, any time that you have anything in contact with plastics, when you have two surfaces that are in contact, there will be some interaction. But the microplastic, nanoplastic story is a very complicated story because we know that they're there. You can find them in the human body. You can find them in every tissue. What we don't know really is what they do. You know, just because you find something doesn't mean it's doing something. Although I think we can pretty well take for granted that if you got microplastics in your body, they're unlikely to be beneficial. But it is also, at this point, impossible to avoid because plastics are everywhere. I mean, you're sitting on plastic chairs right now. And I can tell you that when you get up from your chair, there will be enough rubbing that some microplastics get into the air, you know? So it's also important, I think, to know what is worth worrying about and what is not. And you worry about things that you can directly affect. I don't think that you can't do anything about exposure to microplastics because they're everywhere, everywhere. Yeah. Yes. I mean, yeah. I mean, obviously, if you're using glass, then there's no plastic coming out of it. The question is, how much difference does that make in the grand scheme of things? Because the exposure that we have to microplastics is not from using a plastic container in your house. That's not where it comes from. It comes from industrial emissions. It comes from the car tires rubbing against the road. I mean, the amount of microplastics that come off from car tires is billions and billions and billions of times more than anything you'd be exposed to by, putting your food in a plastic container at home. So, I mean, if there's anything that's going to be done about these microplastics, it has to be done at the industry level, not at home. I mean, yeah, it is better to use glass in a microwave. Yes. Is it going to make any difference to your health? Who knows? Yeah, I mean, it's the same story is that, yeah, if you put something in glass, you're not going to get microplastics in your food. But what I'm saying is that what you're saving there is nothing compared to what you're exposed to, everywhere. It's if I give you an analogy, if you fill a bathtub with water and you take an eyedropper and you take out one drop of water, okay, and you ask the question, is there less water in there now than there was before? The answer, of course, is yes, right? You took out a drop, so there's less water. Is that going to make any difference in any way? Did your chance of drowning in that bathtub decrease? No. Yeah. Which one? Bottled water? It's the same story. I mean, any time that you have water in contact with plastics, there will be some microplastics in there. Yeah. So, if you drink lots of water, and of course, these days people are going around with their $50 bottles of water. Yeah, those are made of metal on the inside, so you don't get plastics. But there's much better reasons not to buy bottled water than the microplastics. Okay, there's absolutely no reason to buy bottled water. It's not better in any way than the stuff that comes out of the tap. And the amount of oil that is being wasted by making those bottles is significant. So I don't think you should buy bottled water. All right, so we'll see you next month.